Some tax trainees, graduates, juniors, apprentices are known for being great pretty much from day one, but others are not. In some firms, they actually over-recruit trainees, knowing that some won't perform well enough to stay. But what is it that makes a great tax trainee? Is it raw talent, mindset, skill? In this episode, we are joined by Olivia Pryer, a trainee loved by her boss at ETC Tax, and she became an assistant manager in 2.5 years into working in tax. She joined us in this episode so that we can delve into how she was a good junior so that you can be one too, or you can help your colleagues become one. A good junior is a huge asset to any team. I also chip in my penny's worth too throughout the episode, from my own experiences of being a junior myself and managing multiple tax juniors. You're listening to episode 115 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps tax professionals with their tax careers.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode. Over my career, I've come across tax trainees, tax juniors, tax graduates that shine and clearly make a huge impact in their teams from the early days in their career. More often than not, however, I come across trainees that are the opposite. I come across trainees that are frustrating their colleagues, being put on performance plans, or just otherwise appear to be struggling. Tax roles are not easy, even at the junior levels, but prior to speaking to Olivia Pryer at ETC Tax, our guest for this episode, I was of the view that mindset and attitude is the main contributor to being a good junior, and therefore that the large majority of people who get tax trainee roles are capable of being excellent juniors, if they want to be. But did speaking to Olivia change my mind? What makes an excellent tax junior? How can you or your juniors be one? Cover all of this in this episode with a view to helping you and others become excellent tax juniors, and if you're a tax junior, this can help you get your career off to a great start and help you be an asset in your team. Rough timings for each section of this episode can be found in the details section of this episode within your podcast player of choice, or by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP115. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP115. One skill that is super valuable as a junior, I find, is being able to find the answers to tax questions using tax guidance, tax legislation, and tax case law. This was a huge part of my first tax role, but it is a skill that I basically had to teach myself over time, and it is something that I find super helpful when trainees in my team are able to do this well. For a trainee in a compliance role, completing tax returns like corporation tax returns, VAT returns, personal tax returns, having this skill will improve the accuracy and quality of your work on returns. It will mean that you can understand why the returns are completed in the way they are, so that if you get a new scenario, you can figure out what to do. For a trainee in an advisory role, it's difficult to get them involved in client work initially due to the need to build up tax knowledge mainly. And having this skill will mean that you'll be able to get involved in the research and problem-solving side of advisory work and to start continually building your tax knowledge early on. And this is what I did, and it set me up pretty well. If you're a trainee that would like to master this skill, or you have some colleagues in your team that you would like to master this skill, then take a look at my Tax Research Masterclass. It's designed to teach all the practical skills to do all of this that I've talked about well. For more details, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. Or if you'd prefer to chat with me, then you can send me an email to jack@thetaxprofessionalpodcast.com, or you can message me on LinkedIn, Jack Bonehill. My contact details are also in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalpodcast.com/TTPP115. Just a quick shout out to ProTax Recruitment, who actually placed me in my last firm where I stayed for 7 years. ProTax know the tax recruitment market very well, but let's face it, most of you are not looking to move jobs right now. However, they can provide you with helpful information that could help you, for example, realise that you're happy where you are, understand market salaries to help you negotiate a pay rise, or help you get more clarity on where you'd like to take your tax career. You can book a call with ProTax by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalpodcast.com/book-ProTax. By using that link, they will put you in touch with an appropriate team member to speak to. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. So if you don't mind then, Olivia, just to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about you and your tax career?
Of course, yeah. So I'm Olivia. I'm an assistant tax manager at ETC Tax. So I've been in the tax industry coming up to 4 years in June. So prior to that, I actually did an accounting and finance degree at uni. At the time, we did a tax module, and I also did a placement at AJ Bell where we covered small amounts of tax, but nothing to the extremes of what it would be in the tax industry. And that was sort of the thing that prompted me to start a career in tax. I was good at accounting and I liked it, but it was the tax module really, and the idea of tax that really stood out to me and fell more naturally. I then landed the role at ATC Tax, which was a graduate role, and then since gone through a promotion, still here to this day. Yeah, and I started my journey doing ATT at the start and then went on to CTA, which I've recently qualified for. So yeah, still at ETC Tax to this day really, and yeah, looking forward to the future with that.
I didn't actually realise that you had a placement, so you almost had a bit of a taste for tax, only a tiny bit by the sounds of it, but you had a bit of a taste for it before you decided this is what I want to do. Then what is it that you liked about it then, do you think, from your placement?
So the placement was more a financial administrative role. However, there were small amounts of tax within that. So it was more the really basic stuff like tax codes and little tax computations. But I found myself just within that year becoming almost a bit of a go-to person for the tax questions. And it just felt like it was an area that I was really interested in. And I found myself, really driving to be that person to go to for that tax question. So even though it was very minimal within that job, it just kind of confirmed it for me that was what I wanted to do. So I guess that kind of led on to me deciding to go and do the career in tax, because then I then had my tax module in the final year of uni after that placement, which then kind of confirmed it for me. So it was the combination of the two really that made me decide to go into tax.
Yeah. Because was the placement you then, was that in an accountancy firm or was it like an in-house role?
So it was at AJ Bell, so they're an investment firm. So it was a financial administrative role. So it was actually linked to pensions administrator, but it was all to do with like doing the administration for the clients and handling payments and that sort of thing. But then obviously with pensions, you do get taxed on any amounts that you take. So we were doing computations and things for the clients and looking at the tax codes and that sort of thing. So very basic stuff at the time, but it was all good learning.
So I'm guessing you had probably a bit of a better idea than most going into tax of what you might be expecting. Then, like when you went into that first role, then with ETC, and you got there, like what were you hoping the role would be, I suppose, in the first case, and then what did it end up being if it was different at all?
I don't know what I expected, to be honest. I think I had a bit of a misconception about what a role in tax would look like. So at university in that tax module, you only kind of cover the basics and it's very compliance and computation based, with maybe you touch on a few of the reliefs and that sort of thing. But it is nowhere near in depth as to what we actually cover in a tax advisory role. I think I kind of had the same view of maybe what a layperson or someone who doesn't even touch on the tax industry would think about a tax professional, that it's either if you work in tax, you work for HMRC, or you're kind of similar to that as maybe not to say an accountant, but I guess someone who would do some generic reporting and tax computations and not really looking at that advisory side. So I think that was my portrayal of what the role would entail, but I knew that it was an advisory role. I just didn't really know what to expect going into it. I think a good starting point for me was when I applied for the role at ETC, they made me do like an advisory exercise, not only so that they could discover what I would be like in the role, but also for me to know what the role would entail as well. So that gave me a bit of a taste as to what it was. I think it was maybe like a question on incorporation relief and doing some kind of research on it. But that gave me a bit of a taster as well before I decided to basically take up the role. So yeah, there's a few, I guess, misconceptions in that way, because you'd expect it to be a certain way. But I don't think, without having the advisory exposure, there's no really way of knowing what it's going to be like.
No. To be fair, I don't think you're alone with having misconceptions. I'd be surprised if there's one person that had none, to be honest, because I think you don't really know what you're getting yourself into. Like, I was much of the same thinking of you, which was doing a lot of like returns and tax returns, because when you do like a lot of Googling around working in tax, there's a lot of stuff about personal tax really. It doesn't necessarily make it clear that is personal tax and other taxes are different per se. So I think, yeah, the advisory bit, you don't really know what to expect really, apart from that you're probably going to help a client in some way.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So what would you say that your mindset was then going into this first role? Like, did you want to make an impact? Like, what were you thinking? Like, what did you want to do?
Absolutely. Yeah. I was excited. I was nervous because, again, like I said, I didn't really know what to expect, but I was really driven to make an impact, as small of an impact as I could have had at that time with the limited knowledge. But I was just raring to go, really. Feel like I've always kind of been like that with working, and I can be a bit of a perfectionist, which sometimes can be to my detriment. Um, but being a perfectionist in a tax role can be quite difficult because you're never going to know everything. So I think, yeah, I was raring to go. I was excited, but again, like I said, nervous because I didn't really know what to expect.
Yeah, always made sense. I suppose as well because, well, the perfectionist thing I can relate to as well because pretty much everything that came on my desk as a junior, I wanted to make sure I did a really good job of.
Yeah,
So, like, I think it kind of drives you to learn and to do better and to try and be helpful. So, from what you've said to me previously, I know that you did a lot of compliance work initially, and you kind of started getting more advisor work as you got more experience. So, I'm guessing in the early days, pretty much all of your work was compliance based. Then, what is it that you did to make sure that you were doing like a good job of that compliance work, and people were going to be happy with the work that you did? Because I know the managing director at your place, Angela, told me that she was always really impressed with you from day one. So you obviously had a good approach to that.
yeah. I think there's a few things really. So I think the first point really would be communication. Is absolutely key. So I guess there's two forms of your communication. There's communication with your seniors, and there's communications with clients. So with your seniors, you need to be clear on timescales and when they want certain work to be produced by, how they want it to be presented to them, because some seniors might have a certain way of working. So it's just having that clear communication with them. As for clients, I think the main thing is managing their expectations on what to expect. But kind of on a similar note is doing your proper due diligence. With compliance, there is a lot more to consider than what you might initially think. So you might have a client approach you and say, oh, I've got dividends and I've got property income and that's it. And sometimes you can get into a bad habit of just taking their word for it, which you absolutely shouldn't. You should delve into that more and ask more questions, because a layperson isn't going to know about certain things to look out for on say, like a tax return. Things like personal pension contributions or, you know, child benefit, gift aid. So I think making sure that you're covering all bases with the client, asking the right questions, and I'm sure a senior can guide you on what questions to ask. Just making sure that you're covering all bases with the client, but also with the senior as well.
So should we focus a bit on around like I suppose the aspects of communicating and working with seniors first, because I think that's going to be it's going to be the main element of a role when you first start working
Yeah.
in tax. But obviously, day one when you start working as a tax advisor, tax trainee, whatever you want to call it, you obviously don't know how to complete like a personal tax return, which I think you're in personal tax, you'd have had to do that. Like, how did you go from like not knowing how to do that to knowing how to do it? Did you have training? What else did you do to make sure that you were learning things? Was there any like self-directed bits around that? Like, how did you go from not knowing how to do that to being able to do it really well?
It was a gradual process, really. So at the start, obviously, I came in not knowing anything, and I had some really supportive seniors who would talk me through how to do it. We had like a process document that would direct us as to what steps we needed to take, with the first step being obviously collating all the relevant information from the client. Once you have that information, you can then start filling in the return in that way. Obviously, at the time, the seniors would kind of direct me as to where to put certain things. And as you're doing that more and more, you start to remember where certain things go. I think it does help if you are studying at the same time. So doing ATT definitely helped with that, because I would not only know where to put things, but I would understand why we're putting it and how to make certain decisions as to why we're putting things in certain places. And actually how to calculate the certain liabilities that come in play. So it was really a combination of doing that study alongside it, but also getting that training in-house and being able to have that time, having the seniors make the time for you to be able to teach you how to do that. And in time, things you just pick up things, you just start to remember where certain things go, picking up certain habits. Especially one of the habits I would absolutely recommend to anybody starting a career is making an audit trail of everything that you're doing. And this is something that we actually started to develop in-house with a review sheet document. So it shows your train of thought for what you've put on the return, certain decisions that you've made about maybe certain reliefs that might be available. So it just kind of shows that thought process really, and it makes the life a lot easier for the reviewer. So that is
Yeah.
definitely something I would recommend if you're starting out, is just make a track of everything and just show where your thought process is.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think what it'd be nice to focus on is because obviously whoever gets brought in as, say, a tax trainee would have the same things in terms of you'd have the training, you'd have the step-by-step process to follow, but obviously those things alone aren't enough to make you do a good job of those things, right? Some people come in and are significantly better than others at doing it, even though they've essentially been given the same resources, right? What do you think it is that you did that made you just go from someone that's doing like almost the bare minimum and is able to do the basics to doing like a good job of it? What do you think it is that almost stood you out?
I think it's having that attention to detail. It's not necessarily taking things as they are. I would always, if I was given some information, I would definitely do some reading around it. And because sometimes you're going to be given information, you might not understand it. So it either you go and raise it with your senior and ask the question to make sure that you're understanding the brief and understanding the information, or, which I think is also just as important, is going out and finding that information yourself and finding out what the answer is and presenting that to the senior. Because I feel like that can make you stand out a little bit more because it's showing the initiative to go and find out the answer. You're not always going to get it right. There are times I've made mistakes with that certain thing, but it's all learning. And I think making mistakes can be just as important. And the good thing is the book doesn't stop with you as a junior. So there's always those opportunities to do. And you can never ask too many questions. I annoyed a lot of my seniors at the time with various questions. So I would say just don't be afraid to ask those questions and take it as far as you can do. Time.
Yeah. There's two kind of key things I think I take away from that bit from kind of my own experience as well. I think the first thing that you went kind of above and beyond by the sounds of it is understanding in terms of making sure that you understand what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. And I suppose went further than what you would necessarily be expected to do as a minimum there. So that was almost like you took that upon yourself to make sure that you understood things.
Yeah.
That kind of snowballed into then you doing reading around it and you like even sometimes taking proactivity and taking initiative to present what you think is the answer and why before being like asked to do that or expecting, say, one of the seniors to do it. I think the second thing is effort, I suppose. Like, yes, you mentioned that you made some mistakes, but I think as like someone that manages people and leads a team, like mistakes are fine as long as I feel like people are putting in effort. And it
Yeah.
sounds to me like you're always putting in effort to try and do it. So even if you got it wrong, people wouldn't be bothered about it. And I think that's probably a misconception actually for some people that come into roles as like a completely untrained person and never done it before, is being scared to make those mistakes. But it doesn't matter as long as you're putting in effort. The time when mistakes I think become annoying is when you've clearly not, or someone's clearly not cared or taken care to try and do it right. They've just done something, if that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, I completely agree on that one. I think if it's a mistake where it come from just a bit of carelessness, it can really show. And I think your senior would know what you've done in order to make that mistake. And as long as you can show that you've actually made effort in doing that, if that makes sense, you can record where you've done certain things from. Like if I determine that a relief is available when I might have misunderstood something, that's just a misunderstanding. It's not the fact that I'd not made the effort to find out the answer. Whereas you might twist it on its head a little bit and say that, well, somebody's not even questioned whether a release available. They've just made an assumption. And I think there's two differences there.
Yeah, no, agreed. So when it came to the understanding side, when you're like doing your own reading and trying to find answers yourself, like how did you approach that bit then? Like, what resources did you use? Where did you go? How did you do it? Because I think that's a skill that a lot of people shy away from.
Yeah, I think so. I had to make sure, obviously, that the sources were reliable sources. And that was a learning curve that I went through over the first, it's particularly within the first year, is that I had the misconception that I could just Google what the answer would be and just find out it from maybe a forum or an article or something that wasn't particularly reliable. And that was the feedback that I got at the time. It was like, this may be the right answer, or it may not be the right answer, but making sure that you're documenting where you're getting that answer from, and it wasn't always necessarily the right place, because some things can be outdated as well. So it's making sure that, what you're looking for is current, and it's from the right place. I think at the time we used a source called, I think it was Tolly's at the time, or Krona. There's a few resources like that which offer to different tax firms. So I think when you're joining a tax firm, they would usually have a resource like to follow. I didn't know much about how to follow legislation at the time. So I would tend to refer to things like Tolly's or Krona for guidance on certain points and looking at HMRC manuals and that sort of thing. But now that I'm 4 years into it, I always start off with the legislation as a starting point and then move on from there. So it's definitely making sure that your resources are reliable. And if you're not sure, definitely speak to seniors about it or get advice. I know that you do something like this, Jack. I think I've attended one of your sessions about this.
If you would like to master tax research skills, be able to find and use relevant tax guidance, legislation, and case law for yourself or a member of your team, take a look at the Tax Research Masterclass. It's designed to teach all the practical skills to do this well. As you heard just now, Olivia attended one of my masterclasses, one of my tax research masterclasses, and she found it really helpful. And she is someone that was performing very well already in tax, and I think she was probably already pretty decent at certain elements, at least, of tax research, and even she found it useful. For more details, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses or contact me on jack@thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com or on LinkedIn by searching for Jack Bonehill. These contact details are in the show notes for this episode. Yeah, I think you did, yeah. I think as well, but the thing about like knowing whether it's a credible resource or not is if you come from school or college or uni and go straight into this job, like the way you would have found information back then was probably by using Google and just clicking on like the first few pages that come up,
Yeah.
and then you take it as gospel. Whereas you don't really, I think, ever experience that might be wrong up until that point. And it's only when you get into like your tax one and you do the same thing again, and you can see that you've either come to the wrong answer or that you can see that the resource isn't potentially credible or reliable, do you realise that you can't do that anymore? So I think that's definitely a big learning curve for people early on. I mean, the typical things are what Olivia said about like Tolly's guidance or Krona guidance, like using those that they're credible, HMRC guidance, HMRC manuals, those things, and they are almost difficult and clunky to use at first until you get used to them and until you know where to look. But yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with using like the general Googling, like kind of what you suggested, as long as you start there and then you back it up with something that is credible. And actually, I was giving some feedback to someone in my team recently, kind of around research. I think as much as saying this is my conclusion, which maybe that's what you did early on, I'm not sure, but maybe you said this is my conclusion or this is the answer. But I think more important than the answer and the conclusion is how you got there and why that is your conclusion. So is it that in this piece of guidance it said this, and in this bit of legislation it said this, and therefore I conclude this? And also, explaining all the things that you've done, I suppose, to get to that point. So then when the reviewer looks at it and go, okay, there's the answer. I can see how they've got there. I can just agree to it. Is that something that you learned over time then? Do you think that it was kind of a bit of an evolution for you?
Absolutely, yeah. I think not so much compliance wise, but more so on the advisory side when I started to pick up that more of the advisory work, even, the basic advisory work. It's learning to not only give your conclusion, but substantiate that conclusion. And also, you need to show your train of thought and show where your resources are coming from. Otherwise, the reviewer, the senior might not necessarily know where that's coming from. So it's not only showing it for reviewer purposes, but it's showing that you're capable of doing that.
Yeah, no, exactly. So should we flip on to the advisory side then a bit then, though? Because do you think there's a difference between what it takes to do a good job in compliance and what you were doing there versus advisory then? How is it different for you, do you think? So how did you make sure you did a good job when it came to advisory work once you started getting involved anyway?
So I think that as a starting point, it's initially that attitude and showing the willingness to get involved from the beginning. Because sometimes there can be a bit of hesitation as to when to get juniors involved in advisory and when they're going to be ready for it. But I certainly think that showing that willingness to be involved, especially from the very beginning of the process, I really found a difference when I would be involved in those initial meetings and the initial calls with those clients compared to maybe when, some seniors would have a tendency to go and do those meetings and then provide you with the brief and then you would do the work. There's definitely a difference. And I think showing that willingness to be involved from the very start of the process, going and, attending those client meetings, getting face to face with the client, it just gives a bit more context as to what you're doing and what you're advising on. Because I think there's a tendency to forget that you are working with real people, especially at the beginning, because I was so used to doing uni work or maybe case studies and examples, but when it's a real life person that you're working with, it just adds a bit more context and understanding as to what you're advising on and why it's important. So it gives your role a bit more meaning. So I think that's the first thing I would say is making sure you're getting involved and showing that willingness and the right attitude to get involved. The second thing I would say is when you are given the brief, is making sure you're understanding that brief in full before starting the job. You might have a misunderstanding about a certain scope of the engagement, and you might spend, quite a lot of time researching or trying to determine a specific answer that might not necessarily be what is required, and you may spend all that time on something that you're not quite sure, or you might make an assumption. And it's avoiding that really. It's making sure that you're understanding when your senior is providing that work to you and delegating that work, is that you do understand it. I sometimes had a tendency to be like, yes, I'll do this, that's fine. Look at it, and then I'd be like, oh, I don't quite understand this now. So it's making sure you're asking those questions and making sure that you're understanding everything that's being given to you, essentially. Some of it is going to need some research. You're not going to know everything, but just understanding the brief and the scope of the job is another important key point there.
Yeah, for sure. And I might be biased with the points that I'm picking out here because I I bang on about understanding as well being so important. Like, and understanding doesn't just mean like you get the gist of it or you have a bit of an idea about what it might mean and you've taken a bit of a guess. It literally means that you have no doubt in your mind that you know that you are correct in what you need to do or whatever. And I think it's worth acknowledging as well, actually, that it's actually really, really difficult as a delegator to always be 100% clear with like your instructions and with giving context and all those things to allow someone who you're delegating to do the work. So I don't think any delegator in reality is not gonna be willing to answer questions or get frustrated by it. I think they will see it as a positive because I certainly do, because I want to feel confident at the point where like I've delegated a piece of work and someone's picking it up. By the time I've got to the end of that, I want to be confident that they're going to do the right thing and that it's not going to end up being something random that we didn't talk about or it wasn't what I meant or something along those lines. Because all that does is it would put me or the person delegating under pressure then to finish off that work. Because if the deadline is, let's say, I don't know, the end of this week and you've given me something on Wednesday and it's not right, it's just a massive pain. So I think you're absolutely right. Like understanding the brief in particular is very important. I also completely agree actually about being on the initial meeting. I think if you're not in that initial meeting, you don't really, it makes it much more difficult to understand the brief as well. I think I'm on the same page with you there. And actually it sounded like then you think that you being keen and having willingness to get involved helped you get the opportunities on advisory more early on than you otherwise would have done. Am I right in?
Yeah,
With that?
absolutely. Yeah, sorry to interrupt there. Yeah, absolutely. I think that showing that initiative and showing that desire to do it will only be positive. It will only give you more reason to do it. So I may well have started earlier or started later, but I think showing that willingness to get involved from the very beginning was key to that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I suppose the reason it's nice to highlight that is because I've had a lot of questions over the years. And like, how do I get more advisory work? How do I get more advisory work? I'm trying and no one's giving it to me. I think there's like two parts to that. One is the willingness that you've said there. So you've like almost sought out opportunities to get involved, which is going to help for sure. I think the second one is every time you touch a piece of advisory work or you get involved at all, make sure that what you do is really helpful to the person that you're working with. Because if they see it as being easy and helpful for them to delegate things to you and to get you involved, they're going to do it more. Whereas if they see it as being like more difficult and more time consuming or whatever, then they're going to be more reluctant to get you involved. I mean, would you say that's fair as well, Olivia?
Absolutely. I think if you can be reliable and the senior knows that you're going to present the best piece of work that you can do, there is absolutely more chance that they're going to get you involved a lot more and in a lot more complex work as well, because they know that you're capable of doing it. So I think definitely just being that reliable person can really help you on that journey.
Yeah, for sure. And one last thing I'll add actually is on the understanding point, because you mentioned about like sometimes you'd go away and start doing the work and then realise you didn't understand. I think that's perfectly fine, by the way, because I think sometimes until you start, you don't know really whether you understand it or not. It's only when you start thinking about it in a bit more detail do you realise that. But I'm presuming in your shoes, when that happened, you would have gone and asked questions or maybe had a meeting with them to get more information to make sure that you did understand before you just powered on and did something rather than necessarily the right thing.
Absolutely, yeah. I wouldn't carry on. I think I kind of stopped where I was and I'd request a meeting with the senior, because I think it's always better to have that one-to-one conversation with them rather than doing everything by email, because I don't think you can really get a thorough understanding unless you've had that one-to-one conversation. So I think it's really important that you are tracking every question that you need to ask and you're having that discussion with them, and make sure that you're happy with the answers that they're giving you as well. Make sure that you take it to a point where you feel like you do genuinely understand. And I think touching on that point as well is when you are producing the work, take it as far as you possibly can. Get it to a most complete version of the report that you can possibly do, because that's only going to help the reviewer. Like you said, if they didn't do that, they're putting the reviewer under more pressure towards the end to get that job over the line. And if they're spending more time on the work rather than, let me review that. If they're spending more time having to make more amendments or maybe finishing the job themselves, that's time that they could be spending on winning work or on maybe something maybe more valuable to them at the time.
And it's just all round positive, I suppose. Yeah. And I think actually, because I think you said take it as far as you can, which I quite like that word, and actually, because this is one of the things I struggle to like explain to some juniors, I think, to kind of get them in the mindset and understand what I mean by it. But like, there's some really easy things that people can do. So I'm guessing you would use like track changes and have comments on Word documents, for example. So I think if you're like getting to a point where you want to present the almost final version to say your manager or whoever to sign it off, like the track changes should be gone, basically, apart from maybe a few where you want to really draw their attention to something, but you shouldn't give them a document that's full of track changes because it's entirely messy and difficult to read. Same with comments. If the comments have already been resolved or finished and they're no longer relevant, take them off the document, because it's a bit like, I always say it's a bit like an exam in a way. Like when an examiner is like looking at your answers to a question, like you want them to be in a good mood straight away the second they start looking at your answer. It's the same, I think, when it comes to giving them a piece of advisory work or any other work. Like you want them to be in a good mood, like when they're reviewing it. So if there's something on the first page that looks messy or is wrong or there's errors in, it's just going to put that person in a bad mood then for the rest of the review. And that's probably where like blunt, direct feedback or sometimes arsey feedback comes from, is in situations like that. Because it just gives the impression, I suppose, of carelessness, which I think is a word you used earlier when we were talking.
Yeah, I think it links into kind of having that audit trail as well. Is if I was producing a piece of advice and I was doing some research at one point and I was putting that into the advice, I would always add maybe a side comment and put the link as to where I found specific information and maybe expand on it a little bit to explain why I've come to the conclusion. So I think that's incredibly important. Also, something that I've learned to do over the past 4 years, which I think is an incredibly important point for proper tax advisor, is to not sit on fence with your advice. That is something that I used to do, and I was never quite clear in my conclusions. And that was something that the reviewer or the senior would speak to me about and say, sitting on the fence isn't going to benefit the client because they're paying you and they're asking for this advice. They're asking for this advice to give them an answer, and sitting on the fence isn't necessarily going to achieve what they want to achieve. So I think it's even if you don't sit on the fence and you come to the wrong conclusion, you've still had the initiative to come to that decision. And as long as the reviewer obviously picks up on that and explains what the right answer is, then I think showing that initiative to do that is a really good trait for a tax advisor.
Yeah. I think just on this, by the way, because there is parts of tax that is ambiguous, it is subjective. So there's not going to be a definitive right answer, let's say. And this is probably where you had those circumstances where you did fence it, right? Where it
Yeah.
could be either or. You got to acknowledge the fact that it is ambiguous, that it is subjective, because what you can't do is give advice to a client that is not necessarily right because it is subjective, but you can be definitive in that you can say, this is my opinion and why, and these are the implications of you taking this route. This is
Mhm.
potentially the alternative route that HMRC could take, and these are the risks associated with that, if that makes sense. So I think that's like quite high level, and I personally wouldn't expect a junior to be able to do that. So I think that's like manager, senior manager level of like thinking. But if you can just get into that mindset of accepting that it's not always definitive, but you can give your opinion or view on something, and that's going to help you. And it sounds like it helped Olivia, as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So from your career so far, obviously you've had your own experience of you being a junior and wanting to do a good job of that. And I'm presuming at this point as well, you've also worked with other juniors now in terms of delegating and supporting them, etc. So what is it you think that juniors should do in order to be an excellent junior?
I think from my experience that I've started to kind of develop in my career and starting to delegate a little bit. I think things that I've noted myself that I've expected or wanted juniors to do would be more to do so with the communication, the audit trails, actively listening. So things like note taking, if I'm giving them a brief, making sure that they're noting down what I'm telling them, because sometimes you don't know whether they're really taking it in unless they do that. So just having that, actively listening and taking notes,
Yeah.
and just anything that I've already really covered, really. So documented everything, making sure that, your research is from reliable sources, um, and just not being afraid to ask questions is my main point. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, agreed. I think one thing actually that many people probably wouldn't do naturally, but I do think is actually incredibly helpful as well, is let's say that you've just briefed them on something, is rather than them just like going away and leaving it there, or let's say asking a few questions, what I think is useful is if they can tell you what they believe you've just told them to do, like essentially telling you their understanding of the task or whatever it is. So I think then what that does is it gives them an opportunity to check, I suppose, themselves on the spot whether they understand. It gives you an opportunity to check whether what they're saying makes you believe they understand, and if they don't, then you can like find the bits that they might not understand and correct it before they go away to do something. So it's definitely not going to be a natural thing for many people to do, but if you can get into that habit as a junior, I think it will help you an awful lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
The only other things I would probably add, I mean, they're almost like different ways of saying some of the things that you've already said, but I think it's really important to want to do a good job because I do think that your actions come from your mindset. And if you've got a good mindset, then your actions will be better. So I think if you go into like every task that you do and you want to do a good job of it, like you want to impress, you want people to be happy with the work that you've done, that's going to take you a long way as well. I think kind of connected to this, but somewhat separate, is doing more than the bare minimum. So, like, particularly, I think I see this mostly with grads nowadays because they almost think that. Well, actually, I had this one time actually where someone was like, I'm a graduate, I can't be expected to do that," and I always thought that was like a really bad kind of attitude to have as a junior because it's your time to learn, it's your time to get involved, it's your time to kind of shine and show other people, what you can do. So if there's anything you can do without like being asked to do it, like you essentially proactively do it, that's always going to be seen as really good from like any manager or any person delegating to you. I think the last thing I'd add is just always try and get better. Like the thing is, working in tax, particularly advisory side of tax, is difficult because there's so much knowledge that you need to know to be able to do it. On top of all the skills, to then be able to use that knowledge in like a way that's helpful for people. So I think you just need to acknowledge it's hard. Always try and get better, even if it's just a little bit every time. So take on board feedback, look at people's changes to your work, make sure that you understand them, all those type of things, so that every day is almost like a school day. I think those things help people to become an excellent junior as well.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah.
I suppose, have you got any final pieces of advice then that you'd like to leave people with? You know, maybe someone that's right at the start of their journey, maybe they haven't actually started their first tax role yet, but are going to soon. Have you got any final piece of advice you'd like to give them to make sure that they, I suppose, get off to a good start and become a valuable junior?
Yeah, I think it's kind of touched on what you said about the attitude and the willingness and showing that genuine interest is incredibly important. I think if you have that motivation, you have the right understanding and the attitude, then everything else will follow. So I think having that genuine interest is a great starting point. I think just being reliable is important and not being afraid to ask those questions, I said before. So I think it's just a combination of everything we've said, really.
Yeah, no, agreed. Yeah, I think we've probably covered everything to help people get off to a good start. I mean, I do sometimes get asked, like, by graduates, like, is there anything I can do before I join to almost like get ahead and prepare? And the answer really is no, there's not really anything that you need to do. I think a lot of it is, as we talked about, is like attitude and wanting to do well. And as long as you do that from day one, it's probably going to go well. I mean, if people do really want to do something beforehand, then I think the only thing you can really point them to is some form of tax resource or tax guidance, so they can at least start trying to get a little bit of knowledge. But the fact is, it's not really needed, really. And I don't think just preparing beforehand is going to necessarily make you a good junior. It's all those things that we talked about in this session today that actually contribute to that more than anything, I would say.
Absolutely. It's learning on the go. It's learning as you go. And, you can only know what skills you're going to need while you're doing it. And hopefully listening to this advice and podcast will help you on that journey.
Yeah. And I think actually probably being a junior is potentially one of the most difficult parts of your career, because you obviously go in knowing nothing. And that's when you need to like learn the most and probably learn a lot quite quickly as well to get off to a good start. So I suppose you just got to go in with the right mindset, put in the effort, and everything should be fine, because that's pretty much exactly what me and Olivia have done, and it's worked out well for us. From my conversation with Olivia, I would say that the three most important aspects to being an excellent tax trainee, graduate, or junior are the mindset to want to do a good job, effort, and the want to learn and get better. If you have those three things, then the rest should follow. So the conversation with Olivia hasn't really changed my view about what it takes to be a good tax junior, but it has just really reinforced what I kind of thought already. But there are lots of great tips that Olivia shared throughout the episode, which you can start using and putting into practice to help you become a better tax junior, or that you can share with your tax juniors to help them do a better job too. All links and contact details mentioned throughout this episode are in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP115. This includes a link to my masterclasses to help you or your colleagues master crucial skills to be an excellent tax professional. As a manager or leader, having colleagues skilled in these areas will make your working life just 100 times easier. But that's it for this episode. I hope you found the episode useful and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.